A manipulator will test you within the first 10 minutes of meeting you. They're not doing this consciously most of the time. They're running a diagnostic. They want to know how far they can push, what you'll tolerate, and whether you're worth their effort. Understanding these early tests is how you protect yourself before manipulation takes root. The first thing a manipulator does is establish a baseline of your boundaries. They'll say something slightly inappropriate, or ask for something small that crosses a line. It might seem innocent. They'll make an off-color joke and watch your face. They'll ask you to keep a small secret. They'll interrupt you mid-sentence to see if you'll stand your ground or shrink back. What they're really doing is taking your temperature. They're asking themselves, does this person enforce their own boundaries, or are they a soft target? The second test is emotional responsiveness. Manipulators are drawn to people who feel things deeply and show it openly. They'll say something designed to trigger a reaction. They might compliment you excessively to see if you light up. They might subtly criticize something about you to see if you get defensive or apologetic. They're mapping your emotional landscape. They want to know which buttons exist so they can press them later. The third test is your need for approval. A manipulator will propose something that requires you to choose between what you want and what they want. It's usually framed as a small thing. They'll suggest going somewhere you didn't plan to go. They'll make a decision about your time together without asking. They're watching to see if you'll advocate for yourself, or if you'll automatically defer to keep them happy. People who prioritize others' comfort over their own preferences are easier to manipulate. The fourth test is your consistency. Manipulators pay attention to contradictions between what you say you believe and what you actually do. They'll watch whether you follow through on your own stated values. They're not judging you, they're hunting for hypocrisy, because hypocrisy is leverage. If you claim to value honesty but you lie about small things, they've found a gap they can exploit. The fifth test is your social proof. They'll ask you about your relationships. How many close friends do you have? Are you in contact with your family? Do you have people who know you well and would notice if something was wrong? Manipulators prefer isolation. They want to know if you're well connected or if you're someone who might not have many people checking in on you. The sixth test is your self-awareness. They'll tell you something about yourself and watch whether you believe it. They might say you're too trusting, or too sensitive, or too hard on yourself. People who lack self-awareness will accept these framings without questioning them. People who know themselves tend to push back. Manipulators are looking for the former. All of these tests happen in the first 10 minutes, because manipulators are efficient. They're running through a checklist. They're not trying to fool you yet. They're just trying to figure out if you're worth fooling. The tests feel like normal conversation. That's the point. But if you know what to look for, you can see the pattern. You can recognize that someone is probing, and you can make a conscious choice about whether to let them in. This is where most people miss the warning signs. They feel the discomfort, but they don't name it. They rationalize it. They move forward. But the person who recognizes these early tests has already won half the battle. So what does this probing actually look like in those first 10 minutes? It's subtle. It's almost always disguised as something else. The manipulator will say something slightly inappropriate and watch your face. They're not looking for you to agree with them. They're looking for you to let it slide. Maybe they make a joke that lands just a little bit mean. Maybe they share something too personal too quickly, testing whether you'll reciprocate and overshare back. Maybe they contradict something you just said, not aggressively, just enough to see if you'll defend yourself or if you'll back down. What they're really doing is establishing a baseline. How much can they get away with? Are you someone who enforces boundaries or someone who swallows discomfort to keep the peace? Here's the pattern. First test is usually small. It's designed to feel like nothing. You might not even consciously register it. Then they pause. They're watching. If you didn't react strongly, they escalate slightly. The second test is a little bolder. The third test goes further still. Each one is calibrated based on your response to the last one. Think of it like someone testing the depth of water by wading in. They put 1 foot in, you don't object. So they go deeper, you still don't object. Pretty soon they're in up to their chest, and you're wondering how this happened. A manipulator is also testing your consistency. They'll ask you a question about your values or your boundaries. Then later, sometimes just minutes later, they'll create a small situation that contradicts what you said. Not enough that you'd notice immediately, but enough that if you call them on it, they can say you're being inconsistent or overly sensitive. They're also testing whether you need their approval. This one is crucial. They'll do something that requires you to either validate them or challenge them. If you immediately validate them, if you work to make them feel better about a questionable choice, they know they've found someone they can manipulate through approval seeking. The voice tone matters too. A manipulator will often use a friendly, casual tone while saying something that should concern you. This mismatch between the message and the delivery is intentional. It's designed to make you question your own reaction. You feel uneasy, but they seem so relaxed about it. So you assume you're the problem. You're being too serious. You're reading too much into it. And here's what separates people who get manipulated from people who don't. The people who don't get manipulated don't ignore these tests. They name them internally. That thing you just said felt off. That tone didn't match your words. That boundary you crossed shouldn't have been crossed. You don't have to make a big confrontation out of it in the moment. You don't have to call them out and create drama. But you have to acknowledge to yourself that something happened. You have to trust that discomfort you felt. Because that discomfort is information. It's your system telling you that something isn't aligned, something isn't safe, something needs to be watched. The manipulator is betting that you'll ignore that information. They're betting that you'll rationalize it away. But the moment you start paying attention to it, you've fundamentally changed the dynamic. And this is exactly why the first 10 minutes matter so much. Because once you've rationalized something away once, it becomes easier to do it again. The manipulator knows this. They're literally testing whether you'll accept the first small contradiction, the first tiny inconsistency, the first moment where their words don't match their actions. Let me give you concrete examples of what this looks like in real time. Someone asks you a direct question and then doesn't actually listen to your answer. They interrupt, they redirect, they suddenly make it about themselves. In that moment, they're testing whether you'll notice that they don't actually care about what you have to say. Most people don't notice. They just keep talking, keep trying to be heard. The manipulator files that away. They've learned that you'll accept being unheard. Or someone tells you they value honesty, and then you catch them in a small lie. Not a huge one. Something that could almost be justified. They told you they were busy when they were actually scrolling social media. They said they forgot to text you back when they clearly didn't forget. In that moment, they're testing whether you'll hold them accountable for the contradiction between their stated values and their actual behavior. If you don't, they know they can keep doing it. Here's another one. Someone asks for your trust, while simultaneously doing things that make trust impossible. They want you to believe them, but they're vague about their schedule. They want you to feel secure, but they're secretive about their phone. They want you to feel valued, but they're constantly comparing you to other people. The inconsistency is right there. They're testing whether you'll notice it, or whether you'll just accept the words they're saying while ignoring what their actions are actually communicating. The pattern is always the same. They create a small gap between what they say and what they do. Then they watch to see if you'll fill that gap with your own excuses for them. Will you believe their explanation? Will you assume they didn't mean it that way? Will you convince yourself that you're being too sensitive or too critical? This is the real test. It's not about whether they're a good person or a bad person. It's about whether you're someone who will compromise your own perception of reality to make them feel comfortable. Because that's what they're actually looking for. They need to know that you'll twist yourself into knots to accommodate them, that you'll ignore your own instincts, that you'll prioritize their feelings over your own safety. The manipulator is essentially asking, will you abandon yourself for me? And the first 10 minutes is when they get their answer. Because if you let it slide the first time, if you rationalize it away, if you choose their comfort over your own clarity, then they know they've found someone they can work with, someone they can shape, someone they can control. The good news is that you can change this dynamic right now, in this moment, by deciding that you won't rationalize away what you see. You won't compromise what you know to be true just to keep someone else comfortable. The first test happens when they push a boundary and watch your reaction. Maybe they make a comment that lands wrong. Maybe they ask you to do something that feels off. And then they wait. They're not waiting for an apology. They're waiting to see if you'll shrink, if you'll second-guess yourself, if you'll suddenly decide that what you just felt wasn't real. This is the critical moment. Because if you visibly soften, if you backpedal, if you start explaining why their behavior was actually fine, they've learned something powerful about you. They've learned that you can be moved, that your boundaries aren't fixed, that with the right pressure, you'll do the work of convincing yourself that mistreatment is acceptable. The second test is subtler. They'll share something that seems vulnerable. A story about how someone hurt them, a confession about their insecurity. And it feels like intimacy, it feels like trust. But what they're actually doing is establishing a pattern. They're showing you that they can be hurt, that they have pain. And once you understand that, once you feel that, you become invested in protecting them from further harm, even if that harm is consequences for their own behavior. This is manipulation dressed up as connection. It's a transaction disguised as intimacy. And it works because vulnerability is real, pain is real. But using those things as a tool to lower someone else's defenses is a choice. The third test is about your support system. They'll ask you questions about your friends, your family, your therapist, your mentors. Who do you trust? Who do you talk to? And they're not asking because they care about your well-being. They're mapping out who might contradict their narrative, who might see through them, who might tell you what you're experiencing isn't normal. If you mention people who are perceptive, who know you well, who have good judgment, you'll often notice a shift. Suddenly, those people become problems in the manipulator's eyes. They're jealous. They don't understand your relationship. They're threatened by how close you two are. And the goal is simple. They want you isolated from the people most likely to tell you the truth. Within those first 10 minutes, a manipulator learns whether you're someone who will rationalize, someone who can be made to feel responsible for their emotions, and someone who can be separated from outside perspective. If you fail all three tests, you're not a person to them. You're a project. You're someone they can shape into what they need. But here's what changes everything. If you notice the boundary push and you don't shrink, if you hear the vulnerable story and you feel compassion without losing your clarity, if they ask about your support system and you answer honestly without apology, if you do these things, they know. They know you're not the type of person they can easily move, and sometimes they'll stay anyway because the challenge appeals to them. But more often they'll move on. They'll find someone softer, someone more willing to doubt themselves, someone more available for the work of being reshaped. Your job in those first 10 minutes isn't to be perfect. It's to be real. Being real means something specific here. It means you have opinions that don't shift based on who's asking. It means you can say no without apologizing for it. It means you're not performing a version of yourself designed to be palatable. A manipulator is testing whether you'll contradict yourself under mild pressure. They'll ask you what you want, listen to your answer, then casually suggest something different and watch to see if you fold. They're not looking for a debate. They're looking for compliance. They're looking for someone who values harmony more than honesty. This is why they often come across as charming in those first moments. They're not being aggressive. They're being warm. They're asking good questions. They're remembering details. They're making you feel seen. And then they'll gently propose something that contradicts what you just said, and they'll do it with such confidence that you'll wonder if maybe you were wrong about what you wanted in the first place. The test is whether you'll second-guess yourself to keep them comfortable. Real people don't do that. Real people say, "I just told you I wasn't interested in that. I'm still not." Real people don't rephrase their boundaries as apologies. Real people don't soften their no into maybe so someone else feels better about hearing it. This is also why manipulators move fast with their testing. They're not being patient out of kindness. They're being patient out of strategy. They know that the longer you stay in that first encounter, the more your guard naturally comes down. People relax. They share more. They become more flexible. And that's when the real testing begins. So in those first 10 minutes, they're watching for your flexibility. They're looking for the moments where you hesitate before answering. They're listening for the times you qualify your statements with unnecessary explanations. They're noting whether you ask their permission before expressing a preference. They're also testing your consistency. Do you say the same thing to different people, or do you shift your story depending on who's listening? Do you have values that are yours, or do you have values that belong to whoever you're trying to impress? This is the information they need. This is what tells them whether you're worth the effort of manipulation. Because manipulation is work. It's exhausting. It requires constant attention to what the other person is thinking and feeling. It requires the ability to adjust your presentation moment by moment. Most manipulators aren't interested in doing that work on someone who won't budge. They want the person who's already halfway to bending. So being real in those first 10 minutes isn't just about self-respect, though it is that. It's also about making yourself a less attractive target. It's about being the kind of person a manipulator will quickly decide isn't worth their time. Your consistency is your protection. Your willingness to disappoint someone rather than deceive yourself is your shield. Your opinions, your boundaries, your preferences, your no, these aren't flaws to be hidden. They're the things that keep you safe. The manipulator is looking for softness. Give them firmness instead. Not coldness, not defensiveness, just the quiet certainty of someone who knows what they want and isn't performing for anyone. So here's what happens next. The manipulator notices your firmness and immediately shifts tactics. They're testing whether you'll abandon your position if they apply pressure. This is the critical moment where most people fail the test. They'll use what looks like agreement, but with a twist. They'll say something like, "Oh, I totally respect that," and then immediately follow with a reason why your boundary doesn't actually apply to them. They're not attacking you directly. They're reframing the situation. So your boundary seems unreasonable in this particular case, just this once. Watch for the flattery that comes with the pushback. A manipulator rarely challenges you head-on when you're standing firm. Instead, they'll compliment something about you. Your kindness, your flexibility, your openness. And then use that compliment as a lever. "You're such a generous person. That's why I know you'd understand my situation." They're weaponizing your own strengths against you. The test here is whether you'll move, not whether you'll be mean about it, not whether you'll explain yourself endlessly, just whether you'll hold the line. When you don't budge, a manipulator often escalates to what feels like vulnerability. They might share something painful or personal. They might tell you about their struggles, their past trauma, their current crisis. And suddenly you feel like a monster for maintaining your boundary. This is manipulation dressed up as intimacy. Real vulnerability is reciprocal. It doesn't come with an expectation that you'll compromise your safety in response. A manipulator uses vulnerability as currency. They're buying your compliance with their pain. Your job in this moment is to separate empathy from enablement. You can care about someone's struggle and still not be their solution. You can acknowledge their difficulty and still say no. These two things aren't contradictory. A person who respects you will understand this. A person who doesn't will keep testing. And they will test you multiple times in that first 10 minutes if you let them. Each test is calibrated. They're gathering data. How much can I push? Where's the actual limit? Will they cave if I try this angle? Will they fold if I try that one? They're not being malicious in their mind. They're being practical. They're assessing whether you're someone they can manipulate or someone they need to respect. The person who passes this test, who holds their boundary, shows empathy without enabling, and doesn't perform certainty but simply lives it. That person often gets left alone. Not because the manipulator suddenly becomes good, but because they recognize you're not a viable target. You're too expensive. The energy required to manipulate you exceeds the payoff. The manipulator will move on to someone softer, someone still figuring out whether their needs matter. And that's actually a mercy, even though it doesn't feel like one. Because the alternative is years of someone testing your limits, pushing your boundaries, and slowly convincing you that your own judgment can't be trusted. Your firmness in those first 10 minutes isn't cruelty. It's clarity. And clarity is the manipulator's kryptonite. So what does firmness actually look like when you're face to face with someone who's testing you? It's not aggression, it's not coldness, it's consistency. When someone makes a subtle jab and you respond with a calm, direct statement of what you will and won't accept, you've just sent a signal. You've told them their test didn't work. Most manipulators will probe a few more times in different ways because they're looking for the crack in your resolve. They want to find the angle that makes you bend. But here's what happens when you don't bend, when you stay steady. When you say no and you mean it, and you don't soften it with apologies or explanations they didn't ask for. They recalibrate. Some will respect the boundary and step back. Those people weren't manipulators at all. They were just testing the waters like anyone does in a new relationship. They see the line and they respect it. Others will feel that boundary like a wall and decide you're not worth the effort. They'll move on to someone who seems easier to influence. And that's actually a gift to you, because it happens in the first 10 minutes, not 10 years. But some will intensify. They'll try to make you feel bad for having boundaries. They'll say you're being defensive or cold or that you don't trust them. They'll reframe your firmness as a character flaw. This is the moment that separates people who understand manipulation from people who will become its victims. Because when they do that, you have to hold the line even harder. Not with anger, with silence, with repetition, with the simple, boring consistency of someone who knows who they are. You don't argue about whether your boundary is reasonable. It exists because you decided it does. That's the only justification it needs. The manipulator's entire strategy depends on you becoming uncertain. Uncertain about your own perceptions. Uncertain about your right to have boundaries. Uncertain about whether you're being fair to them. The moment you start defending your firmness, you've already given them what they wanted. You've shown them that you can be reasoned with, that you can be worn down. But if you simply hold the line without needing to justify it, something shifts in the dynamic. They realize they can't think their way through you. They can't charm their way around you. They can't make you feel guilty enough to compromise. And most importantly, they can't make you doubt yourself. That's when the real test is over. The first 10 minutes aren't about being harsh or unwelcoming. They're about being unmovable on the things that matter to you. They're about knowing that your instincts are valid and trusting them enough to act on them immediately, not months later when you've been worn down. This is how you protect yourself without becoming paranoid. This is how you stay open to genuine connection while staying closed to manipulation. The people worth having in your life will respect that clarity immediately. Everyone else will show you exactly who they are. The people worth having in your life will respect that clarity immediately. Everyone else will show you exactly who they are. So here's what you do with everything you've learned. In the first 10 minutes with someone new, you're not looking for proof they're manipulative. You're looking for consistency. You're watching whether their words match their actions. You're noticing if they respect your boundaries or test them. You're paying attention to how they treat people they don't need anything from. Don't interrogate them. Don't accuse them. Just observe. The manipulator will do most of the work for you. They'll push just a little too hard. They'll make you feel just a little too special. They'll create just enough urgency that you feel rushed to decide. A genuine person doesn't need the first 10 minutes to prove themselves. They're comfortable moving slowly. They're okay with you being cautious. They don't take it personally when you ask questions or set limits. They don't punish you for being skeptical. The manipulator, on the other hand, will make you feel guilty for not trusting them immediately. They'll frame your caution as a character flaw. They'll say things like, "I guess you're just not the kind of person who can trust people," or "I've never had to prove myself before." That's the test. That's them showing you they can't handle normal human skepticism. You're not being paranoid by noticing these things. You're being smart. You're being responsible with your own emotional safety. And that's not something you should ever apologize for. The truth is, most manipulators aren't masterminds. They're people with poor impulse control and weak boundaries who've learned that certain tactics work on certain people. They're not 10 steps ahead. They're just testing to see if you'll let them get away with step 1. When you don't, most of them move on. They go find someone who will. And that's actually the best outcome for both of you. Because it means you've filtered out someone who wasn't right for you, and they've found someone more compatible with how they operate. The few who don't move on, who push harder when you hold your boundary, those are the ones you need to take seriously. Those are the ones showing you that your comfort doesn't matter to them. Listen to that information. Act on it. You don't need to be rude about it. You don't need to make a scene. You just need to trust yourself enough to say no and then actually mean it. Because here's the thing about the first 10 minutes. They're not a test you're taking. They're a test you're giving. And you have every right to fail anyone who doesn't meet your standards. The takeaway is this. Pay attention in those early moments. Trust what you see. Respect the small red flags as much as the big ones. And remember that protecting yourself isn't mean. It's necessary. It's healthy. It's the foundation of every good relationship you'll ever have.